So welcome to the third RiskCan Compound Events webinar. We have two nice talks today by Michael Puma and Michela Dominicis. One of them about global food systems and the other about hydrology and extreme storms. As usual, we have our RiskCan sponsoring organizations down there. And it should be a nice day of, or hour of, contrasting topics as is typical for these webinars, because we try to cover some of the breadth of the interests of the members of the group. So I just have one other slide here, very short. I cut out the normal RiskCan stuff that I've put in before, since many of you have seen it. So if you're interested, you can just go to riskcan.org and read more about the RiskCan organization. But updates kind of from the Compound Events Group perspective. In our previous email, we sent out a newsletter, quote unquote, with papers that had recently been published of interest, just across the whole, distribution of people, both people who are on this list and people who aren't. But we tried to look for very comprehensively and put all the papers that people might be interested in to make it useful. And we'll continue to do that for each month. So like if you publish a paper or you read a paper, please put it on there and it'll show up and everyone, at least in theory, can look at it. Then there's several, the only other thing really is that there's several accepted AGU sessions of interest. I note that they're accepted because they might still get combined, that sort of thing. But I don't have the list in front of me, so we'll talk about which specific sessions they are at the end in our wrap up. But I guess keep an eye out for those, and the deadline will be at the end of July for abstract submissions. And then our group info is down at the bottom there, as usual. And yeah, we now have a list of sign up. Most of you have probably already done that. And that is all for intro, unless Kai has a certain comment. And
no, sorry.
Okay, then we'll move to the first talk by Michael Puma. Well, Kai will give an intro for Michael Puma, and then we'll get started with his talk.
So thanks for the intro, Colin. And Michael, if you would start the screen share now.
Sure.
Well, I'll introduce you. So Michael Puma is a unit director at the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University, and is also affiliated with NASA GIS in New York. His work is dedicated to global food security and land atmosphere interactions. And today he will present recent work on COVID-19 and the impacts on the global food system. And I will hand over the virtual mic to Michael.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation to be here and to talk with you all. So what I'll be talking about today is some recent work that my colleagues and I have done on food systems, and particularly there, as you can see, there with the little video, we're concerned about crossing thresholds or understanding, when these sort of compounding extremes, which is what this seminar is about, the seminar series is about, are there thresholds we need to be concerned about? So, I was searching around last night and found this neat watermelon video, but it does demonstrate what the concern, right? Is there a threshold? Your food system itself is resilient up to a point, and then is there some threshold at which we see major disruption? And the COVID-19 situation is presenting many difficulties and concerns. And so, what's our baseline? And for some time now, several years, colleagues and I have been looking at the food system. And there has been quite a bit of attention since 2008, price spikes, 2011, price spikes. There's this greater recognition that our food systems are sensitive to to disruption. And so we had a roundtable meeting about almost a year and a half ago, and our consensus was, well, food systems are fragile. They are vulnerable to intentional attacks or hackable, and uncontrollable in the sense that there's so many dynamics going on that it's not, an individual policy measure can't. First of all, the impacts are not necessarily clear, and they won't necessarily have the desired impacts. So there's this lack of control. So part of the reason is that inadequate theory, data shortcomings also are a major challenge. And so ultimately we came away saying that our food systems are uncharacterized in significant risk space. So that's our baseline, and now we have these pressures. We have various pressures, compounding pressures, to fit the theme of the seminar series. COVID-19, goes without saying, there's tremendous impacts on mobility and ability to harvest, among other things. Geopolitics. So in the time preceding COVID-19, we already had a sort of global trade system with tension, particularly between the US and China. Then you have sort of your normal stressors, or typical, or more normal stressors, I should say, but these weather extremes. And you see in the bottom left the crop monitor from GeoGlam, highlighting regions that are expecting pressures on harvest. Then finally, if COVID-19, geopolitics, and weather weren't enough, now we have a major locust outbreak. And so together, these pressures are really impacting the global food system. So it requires us to take a look and analyze these pressures and how they might manifest themselves. So one of our major concerns, obviously, is those who are facing food insecurity. So people or households that have sort of a precarious circumstances, they're vulnerable. They were vulnerable before COVID-19, and now we have these compounding pressures. And so one of the first, this is from an article recent in April by WFP, highlighting several things. First is that the risk of hunger is expected, the sort of acute hunger actually is expected to double by the end of 2020. And so their estimates, and you might have seen that the latest numbers, they're estimating 265 million people in low and middle income countries, and up from 135. And this says nothing about the poor in even higher income countries that have significant populations living in poverty. So these numbers don't include those. So they include about 18 or so countries. So these are pretty catastrophic numbers, and it requires action. It requires us to first understand the scale of the challenges, and then to come up with ways to mitigate these problems. To that end, I'm sure you've all seen it, sort of really a rapid expansion in the number of online dashboards that people can visit and look at the data, which is good, but obviously we need a concerted effort. But here's the hunger map from the World Food Program. This is the latest snapshot from yesterday. And the thing to highlight here is, and you see in the top left corner, the COVID-19 statistics by income of the country. So low and middle income, low income cases, and the concern, obviously, as these cases increase, is that the sort of level of testing and the health resources in those countries are much more limited than in higher income countries. So, these certainly can be biased estimates. and the key link here to, and why is the World Food Program even tracking this? Clearly food security in the lower income countries it is sort of the key variable, right? And so we think about food security in a lower middle income country. That's one of the key variables that brings together all different pressures, whether it's socioeconomic, political, environmental, and historic context. So the food security, if we look at food security, that's sort of an integrated measure of the vulnerabilities that people and households are facing. Also, but besides just the supply side of food security, the access is really critical. So you see in the right side of this figure, so we see 165 million. If you remember the previous slide, it talked, the baseline state was 135 million with severe food insecurity. We're up to 165, and they're forecasting us to go even higher. But if you look down that column to market access, look at that. That's 225 million people. So market access is going to be a major, and livelihood coping. So together, those two metrics are things we need to watch, because it's not only, food can be there as everyone knows, but if you don't have sufficient income to purchase that food, you're food insecure. Likewise, if there's disruption in transportation to especially rural areas, we can face greater food insecurity. So this is so that's the situation that World Food Program is looking at. What does the supply situation look like? Well, there are some key areas. This is the crop monitor produced by GeoGlam, which is a global agricultural monitoring group. And so you can see some key areas that we're concerned about. Southeast Asia. And the reason we're concerned about Southeast Asia is that they're a major exporter of rice, especially to some low and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Asia. We also see there's a watch and a watch for much of Europe, which potentially could cause problems with our wheat supplies. On top of that, this is I'm sure almost everyone's heard in the news about the locust outbreaks, and this is really the worst in about 70 years, worst outbreak. And you see it's spread from Kenya through Ethiopia to Yemen. Now the locust swarms have made their way to Pakistan and India. The real concern about these locust outbreaks is that they move rapidly. So the locusts can fly up to 150 kilometers in a day. So it's really difficult to control. And this is entering some key food producing regions. So besides the locust pressures, there's other economic pressures. So as you expect from the pandemic, the real value of global GDP and volume of trade decreased significantly in 2020. So the World Trade Organization came out with scenarios for recovery. I guess the economists have sort of an alphabet soup of recovery shapes, which was new to me. They had the V shape, U shape, and L shape. There's a W shape. Anyways, World Trade Organization came out, looked at 3 of those shapes, and I found even a slide with there are almost 9 different shapes that the economists have put together. But they chose this V shape here, which means your economy tanks, but then it rapidly recovers, or relatively rapidly recovers. U shape is a slower recovery. L shape, it takes much longer to recover. And the World Trade Organization came up with some estimates for how the real value of agricultural exports would drop, and they come up with these numbers of minus 6.5%, minus 11%, minus 12 or 13%. So these are major pressures on our agricultural systems. As I mentioned earlier, that pre-COVID-19, there was pressure from this ongoing trade war between the U.S. And China, where the U.S. initially imposed policies against China and others, but then there was this pretty strong retaliation, and the U.S. ag sector was severely impacted, where tariffs went up from 8% to almost 30%, and I mean just really major pressure. And what this did was sort of realign trade relationships. So China wasn't importing from the U.S. It met that sort of that shortfall by importing from other partners. And so we see these dynamic shifts in global trade systems, which again, it's a level of uncertainty in the markets and in the trade systems, and certainly has implications for food security. All that being said, we are extremely fortunate that we're in a period where grain reserves are relatively high. And this was a post by IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and they're just demonstrating that our wheat and rice reserves are at relatively high levels. Plus, as a consequence, a sort of a consequence of COVID-19, oil prices are low. So we are extremely fortunate that this is the case, because one of the major concerns in 2008, 2011, when we saw global price spikes, was that our stocks were low, global stocks were low. And if you're familiar with this, you'll know that traders and others working in agricultural markets are really keenly watch the stocks to use ratio. So if the stock to use ratio drops to a certain level, they get very panicky and their behavior changes. So here we're in a good situation. Grain reserves are high, and so we shouldn't be necessarily concerned about any supply shortages in the global level. That being said, we have an issue. We've seen earlier in the spring export restrictions by a number of countries. Fortunately, these were more limited in nature, but it just demonstrates the sensitivity that particular countries will be looking at the global markets, and some countries are more prone than others to intervene in their trade markets. So this is another pressure that we need to keep in mind. So we've done some work. So what I'll present briefly, I guess some time's passing quickly, but we've done some analyses, my colleagues and I, to look at risk in value chains. We've looked at the international level, and we have some ongoing research at the domestic level. And I mean, I think one of the key things, this was a talk yesterday by Jason Lusk, and he had this image that they prepared at Purdue University, looking at the sort of the details, or not details, it's sort of a cartoon of how food gets from farm to table, and some key infrastructure, in this case packing and processing plants, becoming sort of a choke point in the food value chains. So I'll briefly describe some of the international level analyses that we've done, and this is an effort to quantify these things. So I'm sure you've seen many articles in the news media discussing these challenges, but we made an attempt to quantify some of these threats. And I'll very briefly talk about the domestic analyses that we're working through at the moment. So the international level analyses, this is part of a study. Here's my colleagues and I. We've submitted to Science. So we're waiting to hear back. So the Science Policy Forum, led by Teresa Falkendahl, Cristianato, Jakob Sheve, Jonas Jägermeyer and I at Columbia, Megan Konar at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Matti Kuma, Aalto University, and Ben Watkins at Connecticut. So just very briefly, we wanted to really make an attempt to quantify and understand different scenarios for our food system. We used the trade with storage model, which is a quantitative model of world market prices. And it's been successfully used to model extremes in prices. And so the model is built basically identifying three agents. So you have commercial inventory holders, strategic inventory holders, and domestic consumers. And if you include trade policies, the model has been done quite well at reproducing spikes in global prices, my colleagues had compared this to the competitive storage model, which is a more standard version that economists use to model price spikes, and it compares quite favorably and even superior in some aspects. So that's one tool we use. The other tool is this food shock cascade model. Actually, we simplified it and we use it sort of in a static mode. Really, this model is used to compute chain reactions due to production anomalies, reallocating trade dynamically. However, we just did a sort of simplified version where we don't use the model, its dynamics for reallocating trade, but just look at supply deficits, because we thought that's sort of a nice first case to understand things. So we defined three scenarios: one for wheat production, one for rice, one for maize production declines. We took 20th percentile historic production declines in three major exporters. So Ukraine, in the case of wheat, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia. And then in the regular text, you'll see the countries where we are impacted by locust outbreaks. And so these are sort of estimates to look at countries that historically have imposed trade restrictions. So that's the reason we looked at Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia in the case of wheat. And then, so the compounding impacts of the locust outbreak. Here we haven't yet looked at the US-China dynamics, but here we're just focusing on export restrictions and locust pressures. For rice, Thailand, India, Vietnam, major rice exporters, and then Kenya, Pakistan, Iran impacted by locust outbreaks. For maize, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine are hit by this 20% historical production decline. So to give you a sense, these are some figures that these are in review, so please don't distribute. But we looked at world wheat prices, and the takeaway message here, just time's limited, is that the production declines alone are not sufficient to lead to a really large spike in prices. Whereas when we have production declines together with export restrictions, we see major spikes in prices. You see the dotted line for 2007-8, the price spike at that period. The compounding impacts of export restrictions by the three countries, Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, together with production declines, lead to larger spike in prices than we saw at that period. Then we also just did this sort of estimate of impaired supply. So meaning, what is the supply shortfall that you need to make up? That doesn't mean that these countries this is not their supply deficit because they have reserves to tap into, but this is the amount that they have to make up for if countries impose trade restrictions on the right. On the left is just the production impacts alone. And so you see it's much more widespread. It becomes a global event, and many poor countries are impacted. We did this likewise for maize, and you see the increases in prices are slightly less than 2010-11, but still significant. And for rice, pretty severe price spikes. So some takeaways, and this is what we discussed. That's why we submitted to policy forum, because we want to make the case that, well, first, the export restrictions have a outsized impact on the spread of supply shortfalls. But we also want to make this case that middle-income countries play an important role, and that we have to think about policy solutions to protect those countries so that they don't panic and impose export restrictions. So very, very briefly, short on time here, just this analysis that we're working on as sort of, so we look at the meat supply chain because, well, first we've seen this have major disruptions in the meat supply chain because of its concentration of the processing, but also as a test case to look at other commodities down the road. So we've seen spikes in pork prices because of some shortfalls. The supply has generally recovered to date, although it still depends on how things continue. And the major key point was these slaughterhouses where we had pretty high levels of COVID-19 spread. So at the moment, our work is involving integrating the food shock cascade model, adapting this to the county or state level within a country. And I'm working with Megan Konar and her team, Paul Ashke and Denise, to adapt the model. And they've worked previously at the U.S. county level and looking at flows within the United States. So we're trying to build a subnational cascade model so we can understand how these shocks propagate through the meat, or one might say protein supply chain in the U.S. So last slide is, where do we go from here? I think we have this urgent need to understand the COVID-19 impacts at multiple scales within the U.S. And this is an important point because oftentimes people might dismiss the U.S. as a wealthy country and other wealthy countries, and it might not be so critical, but that's not true, because there's really high population of food insecure people, both in rural areas and urban and the urban poor. So it is really important to understand the situation in the U.S. Also, as the U.S. is a major exporter, if we have food supply problems in the U.S., that means we're likely to that will likely impact our trade behavior. Internationally, obviously, as we see with the World Food Program, but the final bullet is that we have to do this with a systems lens or a systemic risk perspective, understanding how policies in individual countries have global consequences. So that's all I had to say, and I guess we might take questions now or at the end.
Yeah, we'll take some questions. Right now. So thanks very much, Michael. For a nice talk. So if you have a question, please either raise your hand or just send a message to the chat that you have a question, and then we'll unmute you and you can ask it. Otherwise, it's too hard to manage. So while you're thinking about that, I actually wanted to ask just a clarifying question about the scenarios that you presented with the groups of countries. Are those estimates, or are those kind of hypothetical things that could happen given COVID?
I would say they're hypothetical, but the nice thing was that Teresa at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, she had done a nice job basing those estimates on historical data. So, I mean, she took the 5th percentile variability and the 20th percentile variability levels, I should say, and used those as a basis for determining the level of decline. So in that sense, it's nice because it links it back to variability that we've seen in the past, and it's not just sort of arbitrary. I mean, it's arbitrary, but at least it's based on the historical variability that we've seen, and also the selection of countries is based on past countries that imposed restrictions.
Yeah, sure. All right, Alex Ruane.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for a really interesting talk. And I'm curious, I mean, the kind of main message I got was that the current climate situation is not so dire. And as long as people keep a level head, we should be able to get through this. But these trade restrictions are really where we run into problems. So I wonder if you could just say a word more about how these trade restrictions as they are so far this year compare with what we saw about 10 years ago. and if they are really related to COVID-19 or some other factor that's been pushing those so far.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That as you summarized, that the global supply situation is relatively stable, and there's really no need to, at this stage, for countries to, on average, there's no need for countries to impose trade restrictions. Now, we did see a flurry of these sort of trade interventions, as I said, in the spring, in March and April. The last I checked of this export restriction monitor, that these have started to decline, and we're not seeing any new trade interventions. So I think we're at a lower level of trade interventions than in 2007, 2008, which is a good thing, and this is due in large part to our high reserve levels. So I think the point is here that we want countries to keep a level head. But I mean, I think we're not out of the woods, I would also say. I mean, we have to see what happens in the next year or two, and I think we're going to be facing major issues in the months and years ahead. So yeah, just something to keep this on our radar, but also I think some of our quantitative analysis of the opportunity to avoid countries behaving in a more panicky way, and I think we need more work in this area.
All right, Nidhi Nagabatla, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is about SDG 2, that you started your presentation saying that, yes, we are going to encounter some shortfalls in achieving the goals and targets outlined in SDG 2 on food security, reducing hunger. So could that, to a good extent, be buffered if we put effort, funding, and priority to community level food security, boosting efforts at that level to see that communities, farms in our neighborhood are able to feed populations and people around, so that some of these gaps can be filled and SDG 2 can be achieved to a good extent.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think it's the community level or sort of household level efforts to ensure food security, especially for vulnerable populations, is really critical. At the same time, that those efforts have to go hand in hand with sort of maybe more sort of top-down view of the food system as well, because we need to tackle both of those challenges at the same time. We don't want to see spikes in global food prices because of country-level actions or policy interventions, or agribusiness practices that undermine food supply and then lead to spikes in food prices, which then trickle down and impact the ability of households to purchase food. So, my perspective would be, I think the household level and efforts and funding and interventions are extremely necessary, and the World Food Program is really strong in that space. But we also need this sort of coordination at sort of national and international levels to sort of mitigate concerns or shocks at the larger level.
All right, we'll take at least one more question here from Sushil. I can ask.
All right,
perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, I haven't seen anything on the incident rates of COVID among agricultural workers. It's great that we have a food supply system functioning well, but if the COVID incident rates on the agricultural workers themselves, that there's no restrictions, no social distancing, nothing, that could pose quite a serious risk to the supply chain, I would think, in the future. My question is, has anybody looked at that?
So Megan Konar, my colleague, had pointed me to a dashboard out of Purdue, and so they're focused on the U.S., but they've they've done a breakdown. They have this dashboard that does a breakdown by state by state, and then has estimates of, you know, workers in agricultural sector, workers in, I think they had it in the processing plants as well. And then they did some estimates of, you know, COVID-19 prevalence, but it was, if I understood correctly, it was COVID-19 prevalence within the state. Like, so it's sort of an average, and then they just assumed it's sort of a uniform spread, you know, across the state, uniformly or proportionally to those working in the ag sector. So I guess it's a first step in that direction. But yeah, I think well, first I would say that group is well poised to make progress in that area, but they do need sort of the more refined data to have accurate estimates of COVID infection rates within those particular working groups. So yeah, I think there are efforts to try and do that, but they have a ways to go in terms of data or more realistic estimates.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
Thanks for the questions, everybody. In the interest of time, we should probably move to Michela's talk.
Maybe one
We
last
could take.
question.
Yeah, sure.
There was one question about the preprint available. Maybe that's one
Mm.
question that's of great interest and
Yeah.
fast to answer.
Oh, yeah, I missed that. Sorry.
Oh yeah, so we're still waiting to hear back from science. So I think our plan, well, our plan is, if this is science policy form, so it's like brief form, but if they don't send it out for review, we should hear back real soon. But if they don't send it back for review, we'll probably put it up on archive, one of the archive systems. So we'll probably make that decision in the next week or so, hopefully.
All right, then. Very nice. While Michela is getting ready, I will introduce her. So Michela de Dominicis is a senior scientist in the Marine System Modeling Group at the National Oceanography Center in Liverpool. And her research interests center around applying a variety of numerical models to investigate how human structures and actions, ranging from tidal stream generators to urbanization, affect the ocean state, including interactions with extreme events such as storms, as you can sort of infer from her title, which is about a recent paper. So Michela, please take it away.
Hello, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. So this talk is going to be mainly about the future interaction between sea level rise, tides, and storm surges in the world's largest urban area. So a completely different topic from the one we saw before. And okay, in this picture that you have here in the slide, this is the Pearl River Delta, which is actually the world's largest urban area. And it's, so in the Pearl River Delta, we have 10 big cities, and among these we have Guangzhou and Shenzhen and Hong Kong, which are the biggest. And Guangzhou and Shenzhen actually are the first and the 9th in the world in terms of annual estimated losses due to flooding. So it's a highly populated area, and it's also at risk of flooding. And just to have an idea of the amount of people that actually live there, right now there are like 60 million people there, which is the entire population of the UK or Italy, for example, which is like summing up big cities in the world like Dallas, Los Angeles, Toronto, Chicago, London, Milan, Boston, Seattle, and Dublin, all in one place in that delta. So that's why we are studying that area now. Just to give a bit of background, this work is part of a project that is called UNCODE, and UNCODE is the acronym for Applying Nature-Based Coastal Defense in the Pearl River Delta. So what we are trying to do in this project is to understand if it is possible to reintroduce mangroves to protect the coastline. So to use mangroves and oyster reefs as a measure of coastal defense. I'm not going to talk about nature-based coastal defenses, but just to show you the concept. So if we have a seawall just without no additional protection, so the seawall then has to be probably higher than if we put some mangroves in front of the seawall. So in this project, we are using models, but also some satellite monitoring data, and also some data collected actually in situ about the characteristics of the mangroves, and to put all this information together to understand if it is possible and how big a mangrove patch has to be to actually protect the coast. But so this is what I'm doing right now, but I'm not going to present anything about about nature-based coastal defenses right now. What I'm going to show you now are the results that are presented in this paper that I published in January. So the point is that we are all aware about sea level rise, but on top of sea level rise, we can have other effects that we should consider. In particular, even if sea level rise is going to be the major contribution together with extreme surge levels, contribution to flooding, we have to consider that the sea level rise can change the tides and can change the surges. So the tides can be bigger or smaller due to the sea level rise itself. Same for the surge. So the point of this study was to understand the interaction in between these three processes. So I'm an ocean modeler, and I use models to understand different possible future scenarios. And in the last years, I've been using a model that is called FECOM, that is a structured grid model. It means that we have a variable resolution. So it's very low resolution at the model boundary. It's about 40 kilometers, but then in the delta, actually the resolution is pretty high, it's 100 meters. Here there are some technical details, mainly for ocean modelers, but maybe I should skip those. Anyway, just to say that in the next slide, I'm going to show some results about the model that has been run using different seasonal average for the river discharge for the wet and the dry season. This is the model grid. So as you can see, it's variable. So it's you can see that the mesh is low resolution along the boundary, and then it gets more and more refined in the river branches. First, we have validated the model just to be sure that we were reproducing correctly the present, the reality. So it's difficult to validate a model in China because not many data are available. Here we were using the tide gauges in 4 different locations along the coast, coming from the University of Hawaii Sea Level Center. And these data are pretty old, I mean from the 70s, which is okay because here we were mainly validating the tides just to be sure that the model was behaving okay, and it's okay. And here we were comparing the average tidal range from observation instead in the small river branches with the modeled average tidal range, again using some data from the University of China that is a partner in our project. And again, the comparison is good enough for what we want to study. So the model is, I've just presented just some technical details about the model and the validation. So the model is working okay, And now I'm going to introduce you the scenarios that I've modeled. So first of all, a bit of a background about sea level projection. So in this slide, I'm showing the sea level projection, the global one, for two different climate scenarios, 4.5 and 8.5. And the 8.5 is the worst case scenario, so the business as usual. So if we don't do anything, by 2100, we are going to have up to 2.1 meters sea level rise. This is the 95th percentile. So the global projection is 2.1, more or less, with 5% probability of happening by 2100. And in China, these are some regional projections. In China, more or less, the average is in line with the global projection. So when I was designing the different scenarios, I wanted to look to different future sea level rise levels. And what I'm going to show are the results for 30 centimeters, half a meter sea level rise, 90 centimeters, and 2.1 meters. And actually, this corresponds to the 50 and the 95th percentile for 2050 and 2100. But actually, these levels can be equally applied to other scenarios in different years. For example, 30 centimeters is the RCP 8.5 in 2040 with the 95th percentile probability, and or half a meter is, I don't know, the 4.5 scenarios in 2060. I mean, these are just fixed numbers that can be applied to different scenarios in different years with different probability. So the application is much wider than just for 2050 or 2100. So imposing these sea level scenarios, I was then looking to the changes in tides for the wet and the dry season, and then the changes in surge due to the latest and strongest typhoons that hit the Peripheral Delta in recent years. So in total, as you can see in the table in the background, I was running 30 different experiments. And here are some of the results. So here I'm showing the changes in mean sea level, and this is to show you that the mean sea level is not rising everywhere in the delta of the same amount of the sea level rise that we are having at the model boundary. So what I'm doing is I'm imposing the sea level rise at the model boundary of the domain, and then I'm seeing what is happening in the delta. It's so if we look, for example, to the bottom right figure, so it's the difference between the total water level with 2.1 meters sea level rise and the baseline minus what I was imposing at the boundary. And so the dark blue color in the western river branches means that here the sea level, the mean sea level is not rising of 2.1 meters, but actually it's rising just 1 meter. And this means that the river discharge, which is very strong in this part of the river, is actually counteracting the sea level rise coming from the ocean. So there, the increase is not going to be 2.1 meter, but it's going to be just 1 meter due to the sea level rise. So it's not going to be everywhere homogeneous in space. Second thing I was looking at are the changes in tides. So here I'm plotting I'm showing the spring tidal range and the mean high water. And in this plot, you have the difference between the spring tidal range in the future with half a meter sea level rise and with 2.1 meter sea level rise, and the difference with the baseline. So where it's red, it means that the spring tidal range is going to increase due to the increase in water depth, so due to the sea level rise. And this can be explained because if there is more water, the bottom friction is going to be less, and the tides are going to be less. They are going to feel less the bottom friction, and that's why the water level is going to be higher. But this is important because if in the future we are going to have 2.1 meters sea level rise, then on top of that, if we are planning some coastal defenses, on top of that, we need to add an additional 0.5 meter to take into account that the tides are going to change. This is a different way of looking to the same results. So instead of the map that I was showing before, this is how the tidal range is going to change for the different sea level rise scenarios for the main cities in the Perrival Delta. And what you can see here is that it's linear. So it increases linearly with sea level rise, except for Shenzhen, which is in this, it is in a bay, and still I need to understand why Shenzhen is behaving differently from all the others. So this is still an ongoing piece of work. And the area is also affected by typhoons. And here I'm going to show you the latest and strongest typhoons that it's the Perrival Delta. So I was running some simulations, and at the beginning I was using the ERA 5 reanalysis dataset, which is the best dataset that is available. However, the resolution is not enough to get the maximum wind speed of the actual typhoons. So in the end, what I did was to use the IBTrax data, which is actual observational data, and I was reconstructing the wind field using the parametric model, that is the Holland parametric model. In this way, we have the wind velocity is strong as in reality along the wind track, even if we are losing all the let's say all the background. But it's not important for us in this case because I was actually looking to what is happening along the track of the typhoon. So in the figures here, what you see is as before, I'm showing the surge, the maximum surge with a sea level rise of 0.5 meter minus the surge with baseline conditions, and the same with 2.1 meter sea level rise. And what we see here in particular with the 2.1 meter sea level rise is that the surge actually decreases in this case along the coast, while it increases in the small river branches. And the same, it has been observed with a different typhoon, with Mangut. So again, a decrease of the surge along the coast and an increase in the small river branches. So now I have 2 slides to explain this, but I'm not going to the details, but you have to trust me. So the main effect is that the most important thing is the wind stress, which is more important than the bottom friction in this case. And since the depth is increasing due to the sea level rise, the effect of the wind stress, which is divided by the depth, is decreasing. In other words, same wind velocity, same wind stress, but more water to be pushed, and that's why the surge is less along the coast. And this is what is happening along the coast. Instead, in the river branches, we saw before that there was an increase, and I was suspecting that that increase was due to the interaction between the tides, the atmospheric forcing in the river branches. And indeed, I rerun all the simulation without considering the tides, and I don't get that increase anymore. So it means that that increase was actually due to an interaction between the tides and the surges, so the atmospheric forcing. And this again is the similar plot, but a different way of seeing the same results. So how the search is going to change for the 10 main cities for the different scenarios. And in this case, we don't see a linear trend as we were seeing for the tides. To conclude, so in a delta environment, sea level rise is not simply added on top to extreme water levels, but actually introduces feedbacks on tides and surge levels. And in particular, in the peripheral delta, the amplification of tides exceeds 0.5 meter for 2.1 meter sea level rise. And this is important for planning coastal defenses. But we also found that for a sea level rise of 2.1 meter, actually we can see a reduction of surge levels of up to 0.5 meter, in particular in coastal areas, and we found that for typhoons like Hado or Mango. So in the future, as I was saying at the beginning, I'm going to use all these models set up to see if it is possible to introduce mangroves to reduce the water levels at the coast. And I'm planning to simulate more typhoons because just 2 probably was not enough to generalize the results. And I'm also going to simulate the waves that are completely absent in this piece of work. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michela. So again, we ask the audience to raise their hand in case there are questions, or post the question in the chat. And while you think of a question, I just have one very basic question about the plots you showed. I assume those all assume that the coastlines and the river paths are staying constant in future, as I suppose the coastline would also change if you just add 2 meters water level. And what do you estimate is the likelihood of maybe the rivers broadening or the coastline getting pushed back on these results?
Yeah, that's a good question. And no, I'm not assuming that the coastline is changing. So there are some wet and dry areas that are the areas that are usually wet or dry according to the tides. But in this particular case, I'm considering that the coastline is going to be fixed. In other words, it's not going to flood further. And it's realistic in the case of the peripheral delta because it's highly urbanized and there are seawalls to protect the area. So in this particular case, it makes sense to do like that. But in other cases, I would have tried to have the both scenarios, so with the fixed coastline or with a non-protected coastline to see what was going to happen. And I guess the results would be completely different.
Nice, yeah, thanks. So this assumes a very successful adaptation, essentially.
Yeah.
So there's one question in the chat from Victor Malagon. I can unmute your microphone, Victor, in case you want to ask the question person.
Okay. So my question is regarding human intervention in the physical system, for example, dredging. Is that likely to change? Is that likely to affect the uncertainty around those estimates?
Yes, another good question. Yes, dredging would change the results, but again, I'm not considering any dredging scenario. So the bathymetry is like that, and it's not changing. But yeah, it's something that we should consider. But again, we can model different scenarios, but not all of them. I mean, with an infinite time maybe. But yeah, good question. Thank you.
So the next question is from Yi Wang. I unmute you.
Hello, Michela. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. So I personally have lived in the Pearl River Delta for many months. And my question is that with the local industrial pollution, have any effect on the local ecosystem that might prevent those mitigation effects to be effective, to prevent the grounds of substance and sea level rise, especially the potential mitigative effect of the mangrove growth as you just proposed?
I guess so. I don't know, but I mean, in the project, I'm an ocean modeler, but we have some ecologists, and actually they are, well, not right now, they were in the past few months collecting data in situ about the mangroves and about the environment. So I guess that they might have the answer to that in a year, maybe a couple of years, because yeah, they are indeed studying how the mangroves are behaving there, collecting data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Next question would be by Rishan Chen. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks, Michela. You did a very good presentation. Actually, I have several, two questions. I think, we have a project looked at the compound extreme, even extreme risk, in China deltas, especially the Yangtze Delta and also the Imperial Delta. I think maybe in future we have some collaborations. The question is, related to that is, have you think about, the land subsidence in the Imperial Delta? Because, if you think about the future, I think the land subsidence plus the sea level rise and other issues, that will be a question. The other question related to your work is, do you have, in China, a lot of coastlines fixed, we have sea walls. Have you also think about, how that affect your result? And what is the resolution of your, the DEM? In China, most of the delta areas, the resolution of the data is very low. I think is around 30 meters at least. So what that will affect your result? Thank you.
Okay. About the subsidence, no, I'm not considering the subsidence here, even if it's relevant. So, but this means that on top of 2.1 meter sea level rise, it was the worst case, we should add maybe 10, 20 centimeters of subsidence. So considering that the land is actually sinking. So, but it's not, it was not in my model right now. And about the resolution of the DAM, I must admit that I haven't built by myself the bathymetry. I think it's pretty low and it has been provided by China, but I should check the actual origin of the bathymetric data that I'm using.
Thanks, excellent. And I would say with that, we close the question round and thank Michela and Michael again for their fantastic talks. I'll close this webinar with a few announcements. And Colin has already mentioned this. We have a few great sessions on compound extremes proposed for the upcoming AGU. One by Colin, me, and Olivia Martius and Michael Wiener, and another by Antonia Sebastian, Philip Ward, Thomas Wall, and Hamid Moftakari. The focus of these sessions is slightly different. Ours focuses a bit on the natural physical sides and projections, while Antonia's session is focused on impacts, natural hazards, and past attribution. Just have a look at the abstract and make your choice for what you think fits better. There's definitely some overlap, and just go ahead and in case you're interested in this topic, we'd very much appreciate your submission independent of what session you choose. And in case there are other sessions that you think are relevant for the greater community, please feel free and forward those to us. We have a little newsletter that is part of the monthly announcements, that includes job adverts, relevant papers, workshops, etc. So in case you feel like there are sessions that would be interesting, just forward them to us, and we'd be happy to feature them there. Also, the riskcan.org news webpage has been updated recently, and it features all webinars from the whole riskcan community, quite a few interesting topics there, and also the YouTube recordings are linked there. So have a look at this page. And finally, to conclude, our next webinar will happen on July 29th on the same time of the day, again 2 p.m. UTC. We are really happy to have Daniela Domeisen confirmed. She is an expert on seasonal to seasonal, sub-seasonal to seasonal forecasting, weather extremes, specifically drivers of mid-latitudinal weather extremes, if it's the polar vortex or tropical sources. So very exciting talk from her to be expected, and another speaker that is yet to be announced. So with that, I'll thank all of you again for participating. I hope to see you again next month, and yeah, have a great day, evening, morning, wherever you are. See you again next time.